Have you ever felt that something in your house didn't just belong to you? That's how our story, or rather my nightmare, begins. My name is James, and I inherited my family's old home, situated on the edge of a small town in the UK, a place that many would describe as picturesque, were it not for its dark past that I was about to unearth. At the time, I was in the middle of a major renovation of the house, something necessary to repair the damage of decades of neglect. The workmen had left that Friday, and I decided to take advantage of the weekend to explore the attic on my own. There was something particularly oppressive about that space full of dust-covered antiques and old family portraits with penetrating gazes. It was during this solitary exploration that I stumbled across something that would change my life forever. Hidden under a dusty tarpaulin, I found an old Ouija board. Its wood was dark, almost as black as the night outside, with letters faded by time and a planchette that seemed to mock my sanity. I took the board downstairs for what was to be a chance meeting with my friends who had come for the weekend. Sarah, Robert, and Emily didn't believe in spirits any more than I did. The idea was just to have a bit of fun with what we considered a game. But unlike us, the house seemed to take the presence of that board seriously. The lights began to flicker as if in tune with our accelerated heartbeats. And a cold draft circulated through the room despite the closed windows and the crackling fire in the fireplace. Suddenly, that night of supposed fun took a turn that neither of us could have predicted. And as we placed our hands on the planchette, little did we know that we were opening the door to something much older and more vengeful than mere forgotten memories or local folktales. Something that was there, in that house, waiting to be recognized, waiting to tell us its tragic and bloody story. When the candles were lit and the lights in the house began to flicker, a nervous laugh escaped Sarah. "That's just the old wiring," she said, trying to divert our attention from the growing fear. But Robert, ever the skeptic, put his hands on the planchette with cold determination, defying the unknown. Emily followed, more hesitantly, and together we began the session. At first, the answers on the board seemed like innocent games. "Who's there?" we asked. The pointer slid slowly towards the letter H. We thought it was a fluke until it completed the word hello. A simple greeting which, however, made the silence deepen, and the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a tension that none of us wanted to admit to feeling. Soon afterwards, a cold draft made its way between us, causing the candle flames to dance erratically. It was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in seconds. I looked at Emily and saw her wide eyes reflecting the flickering light. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. The pointer then, as if moved by a will of its own, dragged itself from letter to letter more steadily. We were barely breathing as it formed the next word, one that none of us really wanted to see. "Death! Death!" Before we could process it, the hand stopped abruptly, as if an invisible hand had decided that enough was enough for now. The sound of our hearts beating was almost deafening in the silence that followed. What began as a harmless prank quickly turned into something neither of us could ignore. Soon after the board spelt out death, the sound of banging began to echo off the attic walls. It was as if someone was knocking on wood, from the inside out. A series of knocks that increased in intensity with every second. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "This isn't right, James, this isn't right," she muttered repeatedly. We decided to continue, driven by a mixture of fear and the need to understand. "Who are you?" asked Robert, his voice firmer than his trembling hands. The pointer moved again, this time more quickly. "Helen," he wrote. The communication was clearly becoming aggressive. The words formed on the board carried an energy that seemed to vibrate in the air, heavy and charged with anger. Without warning, small objects began to levitate around the room. A book flew off the shelf, passing dangerously close to Emily's head, who screamed and cowered closer to the fire. Glass from small windows began to vibrate as if a storm was brewing inside the room itself. "We have to stop this now," I said, trying to stay calm as I looked at the chaos around us. But when we tried to end the session, the pointer refused to move to goodbye. It was clear that Helen, whoever she was, wasn't finished with us. The lights flickered with intensity, and the sound of whispers filled the air. Indistinct words that seemed to whisper our worst fears and secrets. The atmosphere in the attic became unbearable, charged with a malevolent energy that none of us knew how to dispel. As the objects continued to fly through the air and the whispers intensified, the entity who identified herself as Helen began to reveal fragments of her story through the board. With each letter, she told a narrative of betrayal and murder, a story that seemed ingrained in the very walls of the house. Betrayed, spelled the pointer with violent movements. Killed by those she trusted. The revelation sent a shiver down my spine, as I watched the shadows on the walls seem to twitch at the words. The air around us became even heavier, as if we were breathing through wet fabric. Distant shouts began to echo through the attic, mixing with the whispers, creating a cacophony of voices that none of us could ignore. It seemed that the veil between our world and the other was thinning, allowing the past horrors of the house to bleed into our reality. Without warning, the shadows writhing on the walls began to take on more defined shapes, like human silhouettes that moved independently of any light source. One of them approached me, and I could feel a penetrating coldness invade my body. I tried to move away, but it was as if the air around me had solidified, making every movement difficult. It was then that I felt invisible hands around my neck, squeezing tightly. I struggled to breathe, each breath a battle as my field of vision began to darken at the edges. Sarah screamed, trying to help me, while Robert and Emily searched for something, anything, that could help us fight off whatever was attacking us. The pressure on my neck only increased, and I could hear Helen whispering in my ear, her words a mixture of anger and desperation. Panic set in as I struggled to breathe, Helen's invisible hands squeezing harder and harder. Sarah, in a desperate act, tried to drag me away from the shadows that now seemed to have a life of their own, but it was as if a supernatural force was keeping me trapped in that exact spot. Emily and Robert joined her, pulling me with all their might, but it was no use. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah ran towards the attic door, trying to open it so that we could escape. However, as soon as she touched the handle, the door slammed shut violently, as if pushed by a powerful gust of wind. Cries of frustration and fear escaped her lips when she realized that we were locked in there with that vengeful entity. The temperature in the attic dropped dramatically, as if winter had set in within those four walls. The air became so cold that every breath was a reminder of the danger that surrounded us. The icy breath seemed to carry with it tiny needles that penetrated the skin, leaving a tingling sensation wherever it went. Meanwhile, Robert and Emily were doing their best to free me from Helen's invisible grip. Robert, using a crucifix that hung around his neck, tried to repel the shadows, brandishing it in the air while uttering words of command. For a moment, the pressure on my neck eased and I could breathe in the cold, painful air. However, the entity soon pulled itself together, and the terror in its eyes was evident as the surrounding objects began to move again, directed by an invisible fury. In that moment of absolute terror, we realized that we had to find a way to deal with Helen before it was too late. Our fight for survival pushed us to look for any clue that might offer us a way out or a solution. Still panting and with an aching neck, I started rummaging through the attic in search of something that might help us understand why Helen was so angry and perhaps calm her down. While Robert and Emily held up improvised fortifications against the violent demonstrations, Sarah and I found an old wooden chest hidden in a dark corner of the attic. Inside, covered in dust and cobwebs, was an old diary with a weathered cover. The yellowed pages contained the writings of one of my ancestors, mentioning Helen and a dark secret that the family had sworn to keep hidden. Reading the pages shakily, with candlelight illuminating the blurred text, we discovered that Helen had been a servant of the house in the 19th century, unjustly accused and executed for a crime she didn't commit. The words revealed a story of forbidden love, betrayal, and a curse placed on her last words. With this new information, we tried to appeal to Helen's sensibilities, showing her that we knew her true story and regretted the injustices she had suffered. However, instead of calming her spirit, the revelation only seemed to inflame her anger even more. The supernatural storm in the attic intensified. Books and small objects began to fly more violently, as if a gigantic force were hurling them. The windows shook with the impact of something invisible, and an antique mirror shattered, throwing shards of glass through the air like shiny, deadly blades. The situation was becoming untenable, and the intensification of the supernatural phenomena made us realize that Helen was a more powerful and vengeful entity than we could have imagined. As the attic became a battleground between our desperation and the fury of a spirit centuries old, we began to feel small and powerless in the face of the power she emanated. As the objects flew with even greater force, a vortex seemed to form in the center of the attic. It was as if the very air was being sucked into it, and sounds from another world, distorted screams and anguished voices emerged from this dark spiral. Emily, gripping my arm tightly, whispered in a trembling voice, "This seems to be getting worse. What else can we do?" In this moment of absolute terror, we realized that Helen was not only expressing her anger, but also displaying her control over the environment. The candles that had once faintly illuminated the space were now flickering frantically, as if they were fighting a breeze that no one else could feel. The shadows on the walls stirred with a life of their own, stretching and contorting in ways that defied logic, forming figures that seemed to whisper dark secrets in forgotten languages. With each new manifestation of Helen, the attic seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on us with an almost physical oppression. Robert, trying to maintain a facade of courage, began to recite words from a protection ritual he had found in the diary, but his words were drowned out by the growing sound emanating from the vortex. Fear consumed us, and with each passing second, the hope of finding a way out of the situation seemed more distant. Faced with absolute terror and the darkness closing in around us, we knew we had to try something drastic. With what little courage we had left, we decided to have one last session with the Ouija board, in the hope of appeasing Helen, or at least understanding how we could free our house and ourselves from her evil presence. We placed the board in the center of the attic, surrounded by the chaos she had created. With trembling hands, we placed our fingers on the planchette, and I, my voice breaking, asked, "Helen, what do you want from us?" The hand began to move rapidly, almost violently, while the surrounding whispers grew in volume and intensity. "Vengeance," was the answer that appeared, letter by letter, clear and unmistakable on the board. Knowing that our efforts to dialogue with the spirit had only exacerbated its anger so far, we turned to the protective symbols we had discovered in the diary. With chalk, we drew these symbols around the board, forming a protective circle that we hoped would contain Helen's energy. The air became electrically charged as we completed the circle, each symbol seeming to light up with a faint, flickering light. As soon as the last symbol was traced, a surreal storm began inside the attic. Powerful winds swirled around, causing the pages of the diary to fly and the candles to go out one by one, plunging us into darkness. Thunder sounded not from the sky, but from the very walls of the house, while lightning lit up the room in intense, frightening flashes. At the height of this storm, a bolt of lightning seemed to strike the Ouija board directly, breaking it in half with a crash that shook the structure of the house. The vortex and the winds ceased abruptly, as if the energy released by the lightning had severed the connection between Helen and our world. For a moment, complete silence reigned, almost as frightening as the events that had preceded it. In that brief moment of calm, While the attic still smelt of burnt ozone from the lightning, we looked at each other in disbelief, hoping that the supernatural storm had finally ended. There was such a deep silence that our every movement seemed excessively loud, our every breath a fearful whisper. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice a mere whisper. "Is it over?" But before we could truly relax, Helen's true nature revealed itself. The shadows, which we had thought were dispersed, began to coalesce into an immense figure in the center of the attic. It was no longer just a manifestation of energy or a felt presence. It was a visible form, distorted and shadowy, darker than the night outside. Its voice, when it spoke, seemed to come from everywhere, filling the space with a chill that went beyond the physical. "I will never leave this place," she said, "and neither will you." Despair hit us again, deeper this time, as Helen's revelation brought with it a certainty that there was no escape. We tried to run for the door, but the shadows moved quickly, blocking our way, enveloping us with a coldness that seemed to suck the very life out of our bodies. Emily, next to me, was shaking uncontrollably, and Robert was holding the crucifix, although his faith seemed to be wavering in the face of that terrible sight. With the last of the candlelight flickering and fading, we held each other, facing together what seemed to be our inevitable fate. The shadows advanced and the cold intensified, a prelude to what was to follow. It was as if the attic was closing in around us, the walls pulsing with a palpable malevolence, and Helen's voice whispering promises of eternal darkness. As the shadows enveloped us, one by one, we began to feel an overwhelming pressure, as if every part of our being was being consumed by the darkness. I could feel my strength rapidly draining away. The sensation was like sinking into an icy, dark sea. Sarah was by my side, her hand holding mine tightly until, little by little, her grip weakened and her figure was swallowed up by the darkness that surrounded us. Robert and Emily, also in each other's arms, murmured words of comfort to each other, even though they knew they would be the last ones they would ever share. Helen's voice echoed around us, a slow litany of revenge and sadness that never seemed to end. "You should never have disturbed me," she whispered as the shadows completed their mournful work. One by one, my friends disappeared into the darkness, and I knew I would be next. The cold feeling was now accompanied by a strange acceptance, the final resignation that comes with the inevitability of the end. I closed my eyes, waiting for the last touch of that cold darkness, while Helen's whispers became the only thing I could hear. When the shadows finally covered me, the last sound I heard was not a scream of terror, but the heavy absolute silence that followed. The house, now empty, was completely silent, the wind passing through the rooms as the only testimony to what had happened. In the center of the attic, the Ouija board lay intact on the floor, the word goodbye never having been completed, a dark promise that Helen's story was not yet over. The last scene, immersed in shadows, showed the board, as if it were patiently waiting for the next unsuspecting players who dared to challenge it.